Hey guys, how's it going? Hello, Lima. I am from your neighbor to the north, so don't hold that against me. Shut up. All right. So I want to talk a little bit about what it means to tell a compelling story. Being vulnerable, being authentic, and being real. So can we all agree that being vulnerable takes some risk, right? Can we all agree that being vulnerable takes some risk? Okay. Taking a risk to share a story in a vulnerable, authentic, and real way can build trust within your community, okay? So before we really dive in, I'm going to be vulnerable with you. I'm going to share a part of my story that is going to take a risk. I'm going to share something about a complete failure that I had, but what that did for me going down the road. I'm also going to be sharing a little bit of practical things, so it's not just all the feel-good, hey, we're going to be vulnerable, and hey, we're going to take risks, and hey, we're going to be really awesome together and tell good stories, but I'm also going to present a little bit of practical things of how you can do some of that. So you guys ready for that? Yeah. All right. So by show of hands, how many of you have been in marketing maybe 10 plus years? Okay. Wow, right? How about five plus? Okay. Have you guys seen sort of a shift in how marketing is done? Because before it used to be one thing and now it's something completely different? Yes, no? I like a little bit of interaction when I'm asking for it. Okay, so cool. This sign, when you walk into our house, is right in front of you. This is a sign that my wife has built. I mean, it's some 2x4s and some paint and some stain. And my wife and my now 11-year-old daughter put together these words. It says, come on in, help yourself. Pull up a chair, put up your feet, and stay a while. Tell us your story. Laugh together, because all are welcome here. This is a mantra that we have in our home for when we invite people in. We want them to feel welcome. We want them to tell us their story. We want to hear them be vulnerable and take a risk and open up and share that human experience that they've encountered in their life. Doesn't always take a quick time. Sometimes it takes a little while for people to open up and come into our house. But the idea is that we want to create an environment where people are free to be who they are and tell their story. So that being said, there was a time in my life that was awful. It was February of 2011. It's probably one of the darkest moments of my life. See, we were living in a beautiful house. It wasn't quite our dream home, but it was close. We had the hardwood floors. We had the open concept. We had a great view out our back door. We had the heated floor. Who has heated floors in their bathroom? They're the freaking best thing ever, aren't they? Especially in Michigan. Well, this was when we were living in Minnesota. So Minnesota cold winters, heated floor, it was fantastic. We felt like we had it all. My business was going well. I had a web development and marketing consulting business. We had 2 kids. Now we have 4, so feel sorry for me. They're beautiful. And at the time, in February, we were about ready to lose the house. I had made some poor decisions in the type of client that I was acquiring who just didn't feel like that they needed to pay for the services that I was providing. I had contractors who were doing work for me that needed to get paid, and I wasn't able to do that because of poor choices. I cared more about the house and the looks and what we had than providing well for my family. In addition to that, my wife was a surrogate for a local couple who were unable to have children. And so she was about ready to deliver. I was going through a significant bout of anxiety and depression, wondering, how am I going to get beyond this? What am I doing wrong? What is wrong with me? How come I can't get clients? How come my wife is mad at me? How come my kids don't love me? How come, all these things? And so we lost the house. We were asked to leave the house a week after my wife gave birth. And all you moms know, that's not a good time for that to happen. But it began what I call the journey to humility. And for me, I needed humility. I had been a guy who thought was being confident, but what ended up being prideful and arrogant. And I needed to be knocked down to understand what true humility was, so that I could make proper decisions for our family going forward, so I could provide well, so I could be the kind of person that I was created to be. So this humility taught me that I wasn't the best husband, I wasn't the best daddy, I wasn't a good leader. I was fake in front of everybody, including and especially myself. When I looked in the mirror, I saw a version of myself that wasn't reality. Who's felt that way before? I didn't recognize the guy that was on the other side of the mirror. I fought that battle, that fine line between confidence and humility. I also realized that I was a significantly emotionally damaged person for things I won't get into here, but I had emotional issues that were stemmed from lots of things that happened with me growing up. But the beginning of this journey in February of 2011 made me recognize the importance of what it means to have a valuable relationship. And being able to be broken down in sort of my most common pieces of a husband and a dad and a provider enabled me to focus on what was the most important thing, and that is relationships. I was able to mend the relationship with my wife and my children and be able to acquire a full-time gig doing something I really was passionate about, back into marketing, which was very cool. So I'm going to be presenting something right here that's a little bit more practical. I'm going to be moving away from the really heavy emotional stuff, give you guys a breather, because I've been very heavy and vulnerable and transparent, right? So I'm going to give you guys a breather for a second. I wasn't going to do these slides until this morning, and I was thinking, one, I think you guys needed a break, and two, I wanted to talk a little bit about how when you're telling your story, one way is you can present your authority and why it's important. So as you're being vulnerable, as you're putting yourself out there, as you are saying, hey, I want to share something important with my community, whether it be my clients, the people that I'm connected with in my network, whoever you're connected with, either through digital or through actual physical contact, you want to be able to prove that you sort of know your stuff. And one of the ways you can do that is having a complete social profile. You can be guests on other people's podcasts and shows, Facebook Lives, LinkedIn Lives, things like that. You've all seen those, and you've all seen people who have been on those. And one of the ways you can become a subject matter expert is to just through education, through experience. But one thing that I've learned, especially when I had my own business, and what I learned through that is documenting everything. Because a lot of the stuff that I learned while I had my own marketing agency, I'm able to go back and refer to even now, even though that business failed, even though that failure happened to me. But I'm able to still go back and reference the thing that I learned. So now that you've taken a deep breath, and me too, because, deep breath, let's talk a little bit about vulnerability and why it's important. One other thing I do want to say is myself and the other speakers did not talk to each other too much about what we were all discussing. So as I'm standing in the back listening to the panel from Damien and Vans and Troy, which they did a great job, by the way, didn't they? Yeah. I'm listening to them, and I'm like, son of a bitch, I'm going to say that. Same with Tiffany and Brian. It's like, but here's the cool part about that, is that we all have something to share that's really important, that I think is sort of becoming a very common thing in how we are doing marketing as professionals, and that's the human-to-human relationship and the authentic vulnerability and risk-taking that it's going to take as marketers in order to not just grow our businesses and grow our clients' businesses, but to create valuable relationships. So I'm going to break these 4 things down as we go, but the first thing is knowing your audience, knowing who you're being vulnerable to. That being vulnerable in the right circumstance can have unexpected results, which I have a really cool story about that, which is pretty awesome. Being humble with your vulnerability, because fake humility is counterproductive. And then obviously being honest about yourself, about you and your brand, and being honest about your audience, and being honest about your prospective customer and clients, and your current clients. Because the beauty of this whole thing about being vulnerable is that it's not just about acquiring new relationships, but it's maintaining, growing, and deepening the ones that you already have. Wouldn't you agree?
Yes. Yes.
Thank you. All right. All right, so first thing, knowing your audience. So who are you reaching? What are you reaching them with? How are you solving challenges? And where does your audience spend their time? I think we've kind of covered some of those things ad nauseum earlier, but like who you're reaching is pretty obvious. It is the people that you want to share your message with, that you want them to know about who you are, what you do, whether it be your personal brand or a company you work for. So by a show of hands, who are solopreneurs, who have their own kind of agency, they're kind of doing things on their own? Okay. And I'm assuming that the rest of you work for another company, that you do marketing or you do something along the lines where you're telling stories, kind of? Yes, no? Yes. Okay, awesome. So knowing who you're reaching is vitally important for both of you. And what are you reaching them with? Well, it's obvious you're reaching them with your story, but it's more important than just the story. It's the message that you want to get across. It's the content that you're trying to drive out into where your audience is. Did I hit a slide? No, I didn't. Okay. One thing is how are you solving specific challenges that a client might have? I mean, I'm sure within the discovery process of talking and interacting with a new client, you're determining what it is, what services or products that you provide can help them with whatever challenge that they're experiencing. I'm sure you've heard that in different sales techniques. It's, finding their problem and knowing that you have the way to solve that for them, finding their pain points, right? You've heard that before? And then learning where your audience spends their time. Sometimes it's at conferences. Sometimes it's making that human-to-human connection that way. Sometimes it's knowing which social channel they're spending their time at. If they're listening to a podcast mostly, if they're on YouTube, if they're on Facebook, why would they be on Twitter, LinkedIn? Any of those types of places, any of those places, you have to know where your audience is so you know how to reach them. There's it's not a food truck, but there's a company called Cupcake Creations, which is in the same town that we live in. And they originally were in this brick and mortar, right in the kind of the main street of our little town. If you blink, if you miss it, they have one blinking light kind of thing. Middle of nowhere, Michigan. And the building was being sold that the owner was leasing out. So I didn't see it live, but she did a Facebook Live video. I saw it a little bit later. where she was, after she had heard the news that her building was being sold, she was bawling, she was emotional, she was distraught. She was like, I don't know what I'm going to do with my store anymore. Because what she was told is that the people who were buying the building weren't going to let them stay there. They were going to rebuild it into apartments or whatever. And so she had to find an alternative. Now, she had poured her heart and soul into making cupcakes in this one location, and now all of a sudden that was being taken away from her. Her livelihood, this thing that she had passionately built, was being taken away. Now, for me, initially, I'm like, a little cringy. I'm like, man, as a marketer, I'm thinking, it's a little bit much. But I understood because the whole world was falling apart. But the unintended consequence of that was that there were a couple of people that saw this, commented on her live video that, hey, maybe you should consider doing a food truck. And then somebody else saw that and said, oh, hey, my brother has a food truck that he just stopped using last year. It's in relatively good shape. It needs a little work, but you're welcome to have it for free. And so she took that food truck, they worked on it, and now her business is thriving. So sometimes being vulnerable in the right circumstance can have some great consequences. It's not always going to be that way. You have to pick and choose where your vulnerability is. But I think that's a really cool example of, man, she poured her heart out. She's like, man, my store is going away, and look what happened now. Now, be humble in your vulnerability. Fake humility is extremely damaging. I mean, you've all seen people online that are just trying to be authentic, but you can tell that they're full of crap. You've seen that before. I mean, it's almost an epidemic sometimes. And we can tell, right? We can tell when they're just like, man, you're just full of garbage. I don't believe anything that you're saying because you're trying to be humble, but nope, it's not working for us. Your audience can easily spot when you're not being true to yourself. Because you have to be true to yourself. You have to be true to who you are as a person, as an individual, as a brand, as a representative of the company that you serve. And part of that also includes some trust. You have to trust that your audience is paying attention to your brand and your story. It's not enough just to know that, hey, yeah, people are looking at me great, but there's a certain trust factor involved that you know that, I see that photo. Nice, hi. You have to know that they are investing time in learning more about your brand. One other thing, too, is when you have clients and you're building this brand, or you're building these stories, and you're building out this vulnerable storytelling and messaging, part of that is celebrating your clients' wins, deflecting the attention away from what you're doing and saying, hey, this client of mine just had a huge win. They got a new client. They got a new prospect. They rolled out a new product. They won an award. They hired some new employees because they're doing successful and they needed to add more help. Not focusing on you at all, but saying, hey, this was awesome. This company that I have a relationship with is doing great. Let's celebrate that. Let's do something about it. Let's have a party or whatever you want to do. But it's important to be vulnerable and know that the attention doesn't always have to be on you or your brand. It's almost just as important to have the attention put on the people, brands, or clients that you're serving. And then also be honest. Because as Fanzo said earlier, I mean, people can smell BS a mile away. There's no reason to make stories up. Wouldn't you agree that your brand, or the company that you work for has enough stories of their own that can be impactful? Yes or no? Yeah. It may not be super deep, or it may not be super captivating, but it's a story. It's a story about what your brand has done. It's a story about what your brand saw in the industry that it wanted to disrupt. Maybe it's a story about how it's a family-owned business and it transitioned into something else, or it's an employee stock-owned company, or whatever it might be. There is enough valuable information and stories within your brand and your brand's experience that you can bring up and tell, no matter how small. Your brand's life is full of human stories, so make sure you share them. This takes a lot of risk, too. Like, for me anyway, sharing a little bit about that February of 11 is a big deal for me. I'm very careful about who I let into this little circle I've got, right? I'm sure some of you are. Some of you are very guarded. I'm that way too. So it took a risk for me to share about my epic failure of losing my house and losing my business, losing the ability that I had to provide for my family, because as a man, as all you dudes out there, don't you think that your identity is wrapped up in what you do? I mean, what's the first thing you ask another guy when you meet him for the first time? What do you do? Yeah. So, being vulnerable takes a significant amount of risks. But sometimes those risks don't involve putting yourself out emotionally or open. Sometimes it's taking a risk of not even talking about your brand at all. There's a story of a music festival in Poland in 2011. Heineken was sponsoring it, but they went more than that. They had no beer. They had no representation that they served alcohol. Well, everybody knows Heineken serves beer, right? But they didn't have any on the festival property. Instead, what they did is they created a tent, a big inflatable tent, and within this tent were some tables with a computer, a laptop or whatever, and a printer. And people would go into this tent, they would type a message on the console and print off a sticker. And this sticker was a QR code. Anybody remember those? Yeah. Are those dead yet? No, I didn't think so. All right. Wow. Sorry, guys. I'm a little too vulnerable there. So they took the sticker and they put it wherever they wanted to or whatever. But the whole idea is that somebody would download this QR code scanner, which ended up being a Heineken app, and the QR code held a message. And you'd walk up to somebody and you'd ask them, without being creepy, if you could, scan their code, and there would be a message that'll pop up on their other phone. Hi, how are you? My name is so-and-so, whatever. So the whole idea was to create an environment where relationships were being built. Heineken thought, this would be really cool. Forget the beer. We sell beer all the time. Let's do something different. Let's take a risk and do something unique that has nothing to do with the brand or our brand's message. One of the downsides to taking significant risks is that sometimes can leave you open to online ridicule. We all know the trolls. Never read the comments. Like that video from earlier about the Yelp reviews that Jimmy Fallon read. Probably wasn't the best way for that owner to respond to that Yelp review, and I'm sure that the risk of responding the way that he did probably didn't go over very well, don't you think? Probably not. Sometimes that's going to happen. But as Fanzo said in the previous panel, you stole my thunder, dude, is that is risk versus reward. Are you going to take that risk for a potential greater reward. Sometimes it might mean some lack of revenue, but as you're building your vulnerable story and your vulnerable messages, sometimes a little bit of a loss of revenue initially can end up becoming a bigger win, because somebody is going to appreciate the risk that you're taking and being vulnerable in your story, and that relationship that you build through that is actually going to pay off more dividends than it would have been otherwise. Taking a risk also humanizes your brand. It spreads your message, and it opens up infinite possibilities for relationships. In my instance, and this is going to sound really sad, but I'm a 42-year-old guy, and most 42-year-old guys don't have close relationships, right? That's just how it is. In fact, there was a tweet that I saw that, this is a religious tweet, but it doesn't matter where you stand in faith. So the tweet says, can we please talk about the miracle that Jesus had 12 best friends when in his 30s? See, I was hoping for a little more laughter, but that's okay. It's okay. So for me, taking risks in meeting some of the people that I have connected with on Facebook through a variety of different ways, through conferences and through being part of specific groups, some of those relationships have produced some pretty significant bonds. In fact, I'm standing on this stage right now because of a relationship that I cultivated through Facebook. Infinite possibilities. And you won't have those possibilities if you choose not to take a risk and be vulnerable with your story. Now we can get into a little bit of practical information, enough emotion and heavy things. Let's talk about some practical things and where you can share these things. Storytelling may be organic in its execution, but it's very data-driven. Wouldn't you agree? The type of message that you might create, where you share that story, should be predicated on where your audience spends most of their time. Wouldn't you agree? Okay. So where is your audience? Well, that's where you got to find out. That's where you have to do some research. That's where you have to spend some time while you're cultivating your message and while you're continually sharing things online, because as Damien said earlier, you don't want to stop sharing and wait till the end of the year. You still want to kind of share stories every day. As you're sharing stories, you still want to do your research and find out where those people are. So if you're a widget maker that makes a tactile product, sometimes it might be worth it so you have a YouTube channel that shows how you use this widget that you produce and whatever you do with it, you know? If you own a women's boutique, where are you going to spend most of your time? Pinterest, Instagram, things like that. Which social channels have been the most effective in the past? One thing you also have to keep in mind, too, is that premier placement in your news feed, because Facebook is weird. It's no longer just enough to broadcast your message. It's not enough just to put it out there and hope people come and follow you and start interacting. Premier placement is based on authentic connections that you make via the stories that you share, which means when you post a story about you or about whoever, or about your brand, or your client's brand, when somebody comments on it, what are you supposed to do? Respond, right? Have some time, have somebody set aside to respond to those comments and those questions and those gifts or whatever, but spend your time interacting with those people that are commenting, because otherwise, they're not going to come back because they think they're just talking to dead air, right? It's a long-term strategy. I was just in a Facebook group not too long ago, and there was somebody that posted, she had been 2 months on her job. She was a digital marketer. And the CEO of this company was telling her that he was dissatisfied with the results that he was seeing from her. Well, after some questions and in the comments, it was revealed that there was no sales team, no sales strategy, no digital marketing strategy, didn't understand which channels that they needed to be on, no strategy at all. And this young digital marketer was expected to produce immediate results without any strategy whatsoever. It doesn't work that way, right? It's a long-term strategy. After 2 months, you might see a little bit of an uptick, but not in the numbers that the CEO was expecting. So understand that if you're going to be telling your story among social channels, it's like any other relationship. It takes time to cultivate. It takes time to get to know one another. You're not going to go meet somebody at this conference because you all are interacting, right? You're meeting somebody new, right? You guys aren't staying in the same tables, right? You're meeting somebody new, you're talking to new people, right? You're not going to go up and ask them tomorrow at the end of the conference to marry you, are you? No, a relationship needs to be cultivated, and it takes time. The same with an online relationship while you're telling your vulnerable story. And one of the ways that you find out some of those things, or one of the ways that you post regularly, is using some sort of scheduling service, some sort of data-driven listening tool to gather your data. Now, I am not in the practice of ever telling you which one you need to go to. I don't do that. I'm definitely not telling you to go see Mike or Jennifer. Absolutely not. See, you guys missed the joke. It was supposed to be funny. Okay. Go find Agora Pulse and go see Mike and Jennifer. Okay. How many of you might be feeling overwhelmed right now? It's okay. A little bit. Yes or no? Okay, that's fine. For me, when I was doing this, I was like crazy overwhelmed. So I ended up having to bring on some contractors that could help me with some of this stuff. So I think there are 2 ways that you can effectively manage this feeling of being overwhelmed. I think the first thing is that if you have a team of employees, empower them to act as brand agents for you, which means that you need to have brand standards. You have to trust them to represent your brand effectively. Get them trained, develop them up as brand ambassadors, and trust and verify. So if you have employees, send them the stuff like this. Send them the online classes, train them, get them developed on being able to share your brand's message effectively. Trust and verify. This was a lesson I learned as a director of marketing for a staffing firm, that you want to trust your people. You want them to feel that they're involved in the storytelling mechanism of sharing your vulnerable message. But you also want to verify that they're doing their job, right? Or if you just aren't able to do that, you just hire an agency. I'm not going to name names like Now Marketing. But wherever you are, see, there you go. Yes. You go hire an agency. When you're sharing a brand story, when you're being real and vulnerable and authentic, when you're putting yourself out there in a real and vulnerable way, you're asking your people, your connections, your prospects, the relationships that you're trying to cultivate online and through just being close to people, you're asking them to come into your living room. You're asking them to pull up a chair, put up their feet, share in the story, be real and authentic and vulnerable, and a relationship flourishes. Have them pull up a chair, sit down, give them a cup of coffee or a glass of wine. Yeah. And let's build a relationship together, because that long-lasting relationship will benefit everybody in the long run through just solid, meaningful human-to-human connections. Thank you guys so much for listening. It was a pleasure being here in front of you, speaking. Just, find me at all those places. Whatever, connect with me. I honestly really do want to connect with you guys. Find me up there. Find me on Instagram, Facebook. Let's connect. Let's build relationships. Let's hang out, have a good time. And a picture was from a couple years ago, but that is my beautiful family. And just thank you so much for sharing your time with me today.